Hey everybody, we are diving into plant parts. We're going to be uh, first off going through dicot plant leaves. Okay, so we'll start with dicot plant leaves, characteristics, identifying characteristics, etc. And then the next lecture will be monocot plant parts, and then there'll be a quiz associated with that. But I will hand out a project assignment today after we get through this plant part leaves portion. Okay, so let's dive in here. There we go. Plant parts leaves. So we are diving into, and this is review from last lectures in taxonomy and plant classification. Remember, we've got the kingdom Plantae, we've got non-vascular or seedless plants, liverworts, hornworts, mosses. We've got vascular plants, either that are spore producing or seed producing. And then within the seed producing plants, we've got phylum Gymnosperm and phylum Angiosperm. Now, I always sort of like this because this graphic, because we see that we've got conifers in with gymnosperms, right? And conifers are really broad. There's a lot of them. And then we've got these subphylums that are like a single plant, right? Which we're all really familiar with, but they're oddballs in the phylum world. Like in the overall plant world, it's like they have their own subphylum that is just them. So one of those is the cycad or sago palms. You guys are probably familiar with those. Don't let the young, small size fool you. These guys end up, and they live for a long time, but they end up at about 10 to 12 feet wide by 10 to 12 feet tall. Okay, so other cool plant, the ginkgo. The ginkgo biloba is a really cool tree. In terms of fall color, phenomenal yellow, really beautiful structure. And then the leaves themselves are beautiful. And then the vascular system in them is kind of like, once we get into vascular vascular patterns, the ginkgo is kind of like like what is that one? Anyways, we're going through the flowering. Okay, so plant parts, phylum Angiosperm, and we this is repeat. Here we go. So we are going into the angiosperms. Okay, so basic diagram of a dicot plant. Okay, so we're going to start with the above ground portions, and these are just the absolute basics. Okay, so starting from top down, we're going to start with the terminal bud. Okay, the terminal bud is an interesting spot. This is typically if you have upright growth. The terminal bud is the portion of the plant that is constantly growing, right? It's constantly going up, or cells are getting pushed down from that. The terminal bud is an interesting spot. There's a lot of interesting spots on plants, but very interesting spot at the terminal bud because that's where all the meristematic tissue is. Okay, meristematic tissue, stem tissue. This is a region of undifferentiated cell growth. And within this region, either stem will be created or bud will be created, and it will just keep going on and on and on. Okay, so that terminal bud, we'll look at that more in depth when we get into inner plant structures. But the terminal bud is a really interesting spot. There's some interesting hormones that are associated with it that essentially say that it tells the rest of the plant that's below it that it is the dominant one and it's going to grow higher and stronger than everything else below it. Okay. Now, that being said, if you've ever grown things like basil or thyme. Thyme has kind of an interesting growth habit, but basil is a classic one. So when you're growing basil, if you allow it to just grow without removing its terminal bud, then it'll typically go to flower really quickly. Once it's gone to flower, it's sort of done for. Not entirely, but once it's gone to flower, it's done its reproductive life, and you usually see some dieback on it. Now, what do we do to get a bunch of basil off of one plant? Well, we want to pinch this terminal bud off. And what that does is it takes away the hormone in it that's telling the rest of the plant that it is dominant, and all of the other portions of the plant, all the other buds, you can see here, there's lateral bud. There's a lateral bud here, a lateral bud there. There was a lateral bud there that's gone to flower, was a lateral bud there that's gone to flower. So if you remove this, all of a sudden, all of the other buds try to start to push for dominance. And that's when you get plants really bushing out. And with basil, the intent of growing basil is so that I can make my kids tons and tons of pesto. They love pesto. I do too. But so when I'm growing basil, I'm essentially, most of the time, as soon as it's planted and established, no longer wilting, it's growing well, I'll typically prune it back pretty low so that I can get a lot of branching off of it and tons of leaves. Okay, so terminal bud, interesting spot, a lot of interesting stuff happening in there. Of course, we have the flower. We don't need to go into it. We're going to go into flowers specifically, but this is the flower. The next one down that we see is a lateral bud. I already explained that. It's very much like the terminal bud, and these can certainly form flowers. They can become the dominant if the apical or the terminal bud is removed. They essentially can become, it's an opportunity for a new branch to come off of here. So again, meristematic tissue in there. Of course, this is the leaf. Okay, this is the leaf. And this portion is considered the leaf blade itself. Okay. Now, next one down, leaf axil. The leaf axil. Now, the leaf axil isn't necessarily a plant part. It's an angle that helps us to identify plants. Okay, so all of these things, we're learning them because we use all of the characteristics of these individual parts to help us to identify what plant it is we're looking at. Okay, so there's some characteristics of that leaf blade. There might be characteristics of the lateral bud. There might be a characteristic of the leaf axil. So the leaf axil, again, is an angle, and some plants hold their leaves almost perpendicular to the main stem. Some plants hold their leaves at a really, really acute angle to the main stem. So the leaf axil is an angular measurement. Jump onto the other side here. We have node and we have internode. Okay, so node is somewhere where a leaf comes off of a stem, and there's always a bud there. Whether you can see it or not may be different, whether it's covered by something or not. But where there's a node, this is a leaf node, and that is where a leaf comes off of the stem. Now, the internode is the space between, along the stem, between each node is an internode. Okay, so between the nodes. The reason that we want to be familiar with internode is because it's another identifying characteristic. whether a plant has very long internodes or very short internodes. Okay, that can be characteristic of a particular plant. It can also be characteristic of something about the plant's condition. Okay, so if you have a plant that normally has, let's say, 2-inch internodes on average, and it's going to vary as the plant grows. Typically at the up closer to the terminal bud, those internodes might be a little bit shorter. And as you get further down the main stem, those internodes typically get a little bit longer and longer. It elongates as it grows. Well, if a plant typically within the mid region of that plant has approximately a 2-inch internode, and I don't even know what plant I'm talking about right now, but just as an example, if it has a 2-inch internode, but then you find a plant, the same plant, and within the middle of the middle range of the leafing portion of the stems, you find that it has like 4 or 5-inch internodes as opposed to the 2-inch, then there's something unique happening, right? There's something different happening. Usually the reason for that is that the plant is planted in lower light conditions than it prefers. So if it's a full sun plant, but it's planted in filtered light or only morning light, no afternoon sunlight, then what the plant will do is typically it will elongate its internodes. It'll stretch those internodes out because its goal is to find that sun. It wants to get as far as it wants to get to that sun because it needs the full sun. And its only ability, it can't get up and walk over to the sun, right? Because we've got this root system down here. So its only opportunity to try to get to some sun is to just try to get as tall as possible, as quickly as possible, which sometimes is just fine, but usually if there's a plant that is in full or prefers full sun, but it's in some sort of shade, a lot of times those plants will reach, and those internodes are elongated, and then it ends up falling over. Okay, so these are characteristics, again, of that we can observe on plants to identify the plants. And we can also use some of these characteristics or parts of plants to identify whether there's something wrong with the plant or if there's some sort of abiotic plant disorder. Okay. So the next one down here, we've got petiole, a petiole. And the petiole is essentially the bladeless portion of the leaf that connects that leaf blade to the stem. Okay, and there's a lot of interesting characteristics of petioles. Some are non-existent. Sometimes that blade is starts right at the main stem. Sometimes there's some plants that not only don't have a petiole, but there's an interesting term, I'll show you them, for when that leaf comes, the whole blade essentially comes off of an elongated portion of the stem itself. Okay, so important pieces here: terminal bud, flower, lateral bud, leaf blade, the portion of the leaf that connects the blade to the stem, the lateral bud, the node, the internode, and we're skipping vascular system for now. Okay, we'll get into vascular system later. Okay, now might as well briefly talk about the roots, even though we're primarily just talking about leaves. If you remember from taxonomy and plant classification, dicots have a taproot, and this is a dicot plant. We see it has broad leaves and not parallel venation. So we have a taproot system. Okay, so a main taproot coming down. Of course, we have lateral roots coming out. And then we have a root cap. Root cap is another really interesting part of a plant itself. It's another area that has meristematic tissue, and there's a big old protective plug essentially on it. Not big, but it's there. And then also root hairs. Okay, so root hairs coming off, and root hairs, we'll get into it when we get into the inner plant and roots. So we'll talk a lot about this, but might as well mention it because it's fun and exciting. Root hairs are actually a single cell. It's a modified single cell. And that is where water and nutrients are taken up through the roots. Okay, so basics of dicot plant parts. Again, we're only going through dicots right now. Okay, let's talk about types of leaves. So for this class, we're really talking about 3 different types of leaves. I added one additional, but whatever. It's another compound leaf. So there's simple leaves, pinnately compound leaves, and palmately compound leaves. Okay, so if we look at a simple leaf, and this is essentially what we talked about in this slide, right? We're only looking at this portion of the plant right here. Okay, and this is a simple leaf. It is a single leaf, a single leaf. And of course, we have the blade. We've already talked about the blade itself. We have the petiole or leaf stalk. It's the portion of the leaf that connects the blade to the stem. We've got bud. We have a bud in there. And if we reference back here, that is lateral bud. Then other parts we have here, sometimes there's stipules. Okay, sometimes there's stipules. Now, stipules they are actually modified leaves. They're little teeny leaves. Sometimes they're big, but the stipules are modified leaves, and some plants have them, some plants don't. Some have very intricate stipules. Some have stipules that look like a little teeny version of the same exact leaf. The purpose of the stipules is really that it typically will protect the bud. A lot of times generally, the bud forms before the leaf forms. And that bud may or may not need protection. That plant has evolved to provide protection to its reproductive parts. And the stipules are typically there to protect that bud until it's developed. And then after it's developed, typically they fall back a little bit and they look like 2 little leaf-like things right where the petiole joins the stem. Okay, stipules. Now, if we look at the leaf blade itself, we have a couple portions of the leaf blade. Of course, there's the leaf tip, and the reason we define it as the leaf tip is there's certain characteristics about leaf tips that will help us to identify the plant. Same thing with the leaf base. This is the leaf base. There's some leaf bases that are reticulate that come out and down and around, right? There's a lot of different leaf shapes, base shapes, tip shapes, blade shapes, etc. And again, this is how the reason we learn this is because this is how we identify plants. There's also the leaf margin. Okay, there's the leaf margin, and that is the outer edge of the leaf itself. Okay, and its characteristics will help us identify plants. In terms of the vascular system that we see within the leaf, we see a midrib, and then lateral veins. And then if we zoomed in on this, we can't, and it wouldn't do any good because it'd just be green, but we'd see a netted venation within there. Remember, this is a dicot. Okay, so these are those defining parts and regions of the leaf that help us to identify that plant. Another look at it in real life or real picture. We've got bud. okay? We don't see any stipules on this one, no stipules. So we've got the bud, there's two of them. We've got the leaf itself, which is from where the petiole comes off of the stem at the bud, at the node, all the way out to the apex or the tip. So tip is also sometimes called apex. We've got the blade itself. We've got the margin, the tip or apex, the base, the midrib, and then lateral veins. Okay. Now, an example of a simple leaf, remember, 3 types of leaves in this class: simple, pinnately compound, and palmately compound for our dicot angiosperms. So example is Camellia japonica, the Japanese camellia. Okay. Now, tons of these, there's tons of these everywhere, but lots of them in Sacramento. They really like it here. Usually when you're picking camellias, you're picking camellias for their mature size, their flower color or form, and when they flower. Okay, with Camellia japonicas, there's an early, a mid, and a late flowering camellia. Okay, so when you're looking at camellias, you should be able to look at that cultivated variety, and you should be able to see it is a certain color flower, and it's an early, mid, or late blooming camellia. So that just means that within the blooming time of camellias, some camellias tend to bloom early, some middle of that period, and then some late. Okay, so if you're dealing with a gardener, you want a garden that has really prolonged blooms, well, you wouldn't probably just pick one single camellia. You might pick several different camellias that bloom either early, middle, or late. Okay. Now, if we look at the camellia leaf, we see that it is a simple leaf. Okay, so this is an example of a simple leaf. This one is the most simple. Okay, so on to compound leaves. Okay, 2 types of compound leaves. There's pinnately compound and there's palmately compound. Okay, so pinnately compound, the way I like to remember it is that it's like a single pin that comes up through it. This is the leaf itself. This entire thing here is the leaf itself with petiole. And then if this was a simple leaf, this would essentially be considered the midrib. Okay, but this is a compound leaf. So you've got a pinnately compound, okay, with leaflets coming off of the rachis. Okay, so the rachis is almost like the midrib of a simple leaf. Okay, because compound leaves still have petioles, that portion of the leaf that connects the stem at the node to the leaf blade. And those together make up the entire leaf. So with compound leaves, we have a petiole, leaflets, and then those leaflets are joined by a rachis. Okay, rachis. The other pinnately compound looks very similar. Okay, and I'll get into the difference in a second here, but the other one looks really similar. Same thing, we've got a bud, the stem, node, petiole. After the first set of leaflets come off, it is the rachis, leaflet, leaflet, leaflet. Now with palmately compound leaves, it's essentially the same. There is no rachis, and the arrangement of the leaflets is palm-like, like your hand. Okay. So palm-like, bud, petiole coming off of the stem at the node, petiole coming to the leaflets that are palmately arranged. Okay. So again, looking at a single pinnately compound leaf, we've got the stem, the petiole, the petiolole. That's a tough one. Now, what the petiolole is from the rachis to the leaflet blade. Okay, that connection. Okay, that's what that's pointing out. Sometimes there's a long one, sometimes there's a short one, sometimes it's non-existent. Again, these are ways that we can identify plants. We've got the rachis itself and then the leaflets. Again, palmately compound, pinnately compound, rachis, leaflets, petiolole, petiole. I'm having a real hard time with that one. Petiolole. We're just going to leave it at that. So palmate compound, pinnate compound, simple. Okay. Now, there's a little bit of a difference. Both these are pinnately compound. Pinnately compound. Now, here's another identifying characteristic here. We've got even and odd pinnate. Even pinnate do not have a terminal leaflet. Odd pinnate do have a terminal leaflet. Okay. So this right here could be a Chinese pistache. Okay. Pistacia chinensis. Those leaflets or those compound leaves are even. They don't have a terminal leaflet. This one right here is a rose. Okay. Now roses max out at 7. Okay. So as that leaflet grows, usually it has 3 and then it gets 2 more and 2 more. But roses have a terminal leaflet. Roses are odd pinnate because there's an odd number of leaflets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And this one I won't count, but you can see it's even. Examples. An example of a palmately compound leaf is Aesculus californica. Aesculus californica. Now, in your quiz on the plant parts, I'm not going to quiz you at all on plants. Okay, I'm not going to say what is this leaf, right? I'm not going to do that. What we're doing is we're just learning leaves, structures, parts, etc. Right now, we're not quizzing on plants at this point. Okay, but I'm just giving you examples of a palmately compound leaf. And the Aesculus californica, the California buckeye, perfect example of a palmately compound leaf. These guys, this is a really cool plant. I'm almost positive that the majority of you guys have seen this. Obviously, California buckeye. This is why it's called California buckeyes, because when that shell starts to split off the leaf, it looks like a buckeye. These guys flower amazingly in spring, just absolutely phenomenal flower show. In a really heavy rain season, you just get amazing shows of flowers on it. Now, this is an interesting one, and frankly, it makes it a little bit tough for me to sell clients on using this in landscapes because it goes drought dormant. It goes summer dormant. Okay, this Aesculus californica, it really only hangs out for a couple months a year in terms of its leaves and flowers. In spring, leaves out, flowers out, looks gorgeous. And then by the time we get dry in California, right, we're June-ish, by the time we get dry, it starts fading. Okay, so it's drought dormant, it's summer dormant. As soon as it starts getting too hot, you keep an eye out. All of a sudden, all of those leaves just brown out and it looks like the thing died. It's just going dormant. It just shows up when it needs to, all its glory, starts getting hot out and it says, hey, I'll see you next April. And you can see this out in nature. You can see it in, urban landscapes here and there. But in nature, you see this June, July, you start to see these things completely faded out. But great plant and great example of Aesculus california, of a palmately compound leaf. Odd compound leaf. Okay, this is a raywood ash, Fraxinus oxycarpa raywood. This is the raywood ash. You see this guy right here, cultivated variety. Okay, genus, specific epithet, cultivated variety. So this is what our raywood ashes look like in spring into summer. This is what our raywood ashes look like in fall. And here is the odd pinnately compound leaf. Okay, you see that it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so it has that terminal leaflet. Example of an even compound leaf, we've got Pistacia chinensis, the Chinese pistachio. This is what the tree looks like in spring and through summer. This is why people love it, because in fall it just blazes. And then here, what do we got? We've got a even pinnately compound leaf. Even pinnately compound leaf. Okay, so example of even pinnately compound leaf. Be careful with these ones. Make sure that if you're using these, you only want to use male. I think you can only get male. Anything you're getting from cutting is going to be male. And most of the Pistacia chinensis that are produced and sold in nurseries are guaranteed male. But what they're finding is Pistacia chinensis is popping up as invasive or potentially invasive in our waterways. Okay, so when there's males and females out there, they're going to produce seed. Those seeds, when they find, especially on the levees, this is a problem. They're very happy there and they'll absolutely thrive. Now, it's Pistacia chinensis. The chinensis portion of the species name means that it's of or from China. Now, China's climate's very different than ours, right? We live in a Mediterranean climate, so it's very dry in the summertime. Majority of China is not very dry in the summertime. It's much more humid. So that's why this one is popping up as invasive primarily in our riparian areas, in our river or creek areas, because there's always water there. You don't see it popping up as invasive in areas outside of riparian environments because there's just not enough water in the soil in the summertime to support the plant without any irrigation. Just some little side tidbits. I'm not going to quiz you on that. All right. I didn't mention this one earlier, but it's worth mentioning. Okay, we're talking about compound leaves, right? We went through even pinnate, odd pinnate, and palmate compound leaves. Now, there's some extra flips to this whole thing, okay? Bipinnately compound leaves, bipinnately compound leaves. So this is Nandina domestica. This is heavenly bamboo. And when you're looking at that heavenly bamboo, you're not looking at a bunch of individual leaves. You're looking at a bunch of individual leaflets, okay? Heavenly bamboo has a bipinnately compound leaf. And what that means is you have pinnate, okay, compound, but there's a rachis that comes off of the main rachis, okay? So actually this right here, here to here is going to be the petiolol. But again, I'm not going there. So bipinnately compound leaf, bipinnately compound leaf. Okay, so again, all of these are ways that we can identify leaves. Now, if you're looking at a leaf like this, a lot of times it's pretty natural to look at this leaf and go, wow, that's a lot of very small leaves. Well, the way that you tell the difference, and this is probably a good example. Just blow this up really quick. So here you've got the node, you've got a bud, and then you've got the petiole. So petiole going to leaflets. Okay. Now you should be able to see a bud right there. When you look at this leaf and you look at the what would be the axil, the leaf axil, you're not going to see any bud there. Okay. And that's the difference. So if we pop back up in here, look at simple leaf, bud, leaf. We look at the compound leaf, bud, petiole, petiolal, rachis, no bud, where the leaflet branches off of the rachis. Okay, that's how you tell. You want to take a good look at it. Now, really quick, I'm sure you noticed this, back to this Nandina domestica, do not do this. Okay, this is somebody that doesn't know how this plant grows. Okay, it's very important. And what I'm hoping that part of what you get out of this class is that you start to understand that you can observe the plant, understand how it grows, and then care for that plant the proper way. Now, this right here, when a Nandina domestica or a heavenly bamboo is hedged with hedging shears, essentially what they're doing is they're just ripping this leaf right in half. Okay, they're just cutting this thing all up. Now, if you did that to a simple leaf, right? If you just cut this leaf off right here, what do we expect is going to happen? Okay, we kind of know exactly what's going to happen. The plant is going to realize that it has an injury on a location of the plant that has no ability to heal its wound, no ability to produce new cells that would fix the wound. Remember, there's only a couple parts on plants that have that ability, that have that meristematic tissue. Okay, it is not within the leaf blade. It's at terminal buds, lateral buds, root caps, nodes. Okay, usually there's some interesting stuff within the nodes that we can play with, but so if you went through and you ripped this leaf right in half, what the plant's reaction is going to be is, ooh. That's the very first reaction. The plant is going to say, ooh. The next reaction is the plant is going to say, okay, this is bad because this is ripped in half. I've got veins that are pushing water with nutrients out, and I'm going to lose water out of that. The first thing it's going to do is going to desiccate at the wound to try to seal in that water loss. Doesn't want to lose water uncontrolled. The next thing it's going to do, and this gets a little deeper into plant physiology, but it's worth mentioning. The next thing it's going to do is it's going to allow the portion of the leaf that's remaining to die out, and it's going to create an abscisic layer where the petiole meets the node. Okay, an abscisic layer where the petiole meets the node. What that means is there's a layer at the connection point between the petiole and the stem itself that is essentially a separation point. Okay, so when under stress, the plant will get rid of some of its leaves. And you've probably experienced this. A plant that is maybe severely underwatered, or sometimes it's a plant that's significantly overwatered. This happens a lot with ceanothus. When you overwater ceanothus, the oldest leaves will turn yellow. And if you go up to that plant and shake it, they'll all fall off. Okay, so what's happened is that plant realizes that it's being overwatered. It's going to get rid of its oldest leaves because at that point, it's going to rely on only new fresh growth. And so it allows those to yellow out. Okay, there's some transfer of nutrients and some weird stuff that happens, breakdown of chloroplast, blah, blah, blah. It's going to do that. And then it's also going to create an abscisic layer so that that leaf can fall off. But what that abscisic layer does is it seals in the wound. So it goes, okay, well, I've got so back to our case where we're cutting this thing in half, right? It's going to say, ooh, I got a wound out here that I can't fix. So create the abscisic layer, and essentially it seals off any entry into that plant, okay? So imagine what happens if we cut a simple leaf in half. Now come on down to our Nandina domestica, and it's the same exact thing. The same exact thing. When you cut a compound leaf in half, it's very much like cutting a simple leaf in half, okay? The plant has no ability to compartmentalize its wound or heal its wound, okay? So it sends the plant into some shock. So don't do this, okay? And frankly, heavenly bamboos look way more beautiful like this than they do like this. Now, little side note tip, the way that you actually care for Nandina domestica is pruning out 1/3 of the oldest canes from the bottom of the plant. 1/3 of the oldest canes from the bottom of the plant. You do not hedge these, okay? If you hedge them, they just get more and more crowded, okay? So the best way, and frankly, the easiest, fastest, and cleanest way to care for Nandina domestica is the base of that plant. You look at the base. If there's 15 canes that are popping up that have compound leaves coming off of it up top, find the oldest 5 of them, take your hand shears and prune those out. I'm looking around for my hand shears. I don't see them. Anyways, prune those out at the base. Now think about the mess factor here. Pruning out 5 main canes from the base, that's 5 cuts. And all of those main canes you have in your hand with no mess. As opposed to using hedging shears on this, you're just creating a mess. Okay, you're creating a mess. So side note, identifying characteristics, etc. Next identifying characteristic of leaves, lobes, lobed leaves. Okay, so different types of lobes. These you can probably recognize that these are all oak leaves, all oak leaves. This one is some sort of platanus. It's some sort of sycamore. More than likely, it's the Platanus X hispanica, X hybrid, right? Also known as the London plane tree. Okay, there is a Platanus racemosa, that's the California sycamore, much larger leaf and little sort of an unreliable shape, but these are lobes, and the lobes are these portions that come out. Okay, so when you see that, that is lobed. That's a lobed leaf. Okay, and this one is pinnately lobed because it has a midrib that comes, or a mid vein that comes up through it. Back up here to our diagram. There we go. We've got a midrib, and then we've got lateral veins. So if we look at these lobed oak leaves, we're going to see a midrib and then lateral veins popping off of that midrib. With a palmately lobed, we have a single point where several different veins come through, main veins or main ribs, okay? Briefly talk about conifer leaves and their different identifying characteristics. These are all shaped leaves, AWL. All is a tool that is used to poke holes into leather. Okay, you can use an awl to do a lot of things, but that's why it was originally made, was something that can poke holes through leather. Same shape. all-shaped leaf. There's also scale-like leaves. Okay, many junipers have scale-like leaves. Needle-like leaves. Okay, so most pine trees have needle-like leaves. Cedars have needle-like leaves. And then there's linear leaves. Okay, and a great example of linear leaves, a plant that has linear leaves, are redwoods. Okay, and these are pictures of redwoods. This is a really good identifying characteristic of a redwood leaf, is that it almost looks like a surfboard, right? Like a good old longboard. So we've got these long stripes, two long stripes on the underside of those leaves. Okay, so all shaped leaves, scale like leaves, needle like leaves, linear leaves for conifer leaves. Now back to some of those special leaves. Remember we talked about stipule, okay? It's a modified leaf. And typically that stipule is originally meant to protect the bud, okay? Protect the bud. Now there's some other like oddballs too. Poinsettia, okay? Poinsettia is actually a euphorbia, okay? Euphorbia, there's a bunch of weirdo euphorbias. They're really cool plants, but a lot of people don't know that poinsettia is actually a euphorbia. Now, poinsettias are grown for sale during the holiday seasons throughout December, typically, right? Now, these are not leaves and they're not flowers, okay? This is the flower of the poinsettia. These are actually bracts, just like the bougainvillea, okay? A lot of people think of these really colorful portions of the bougainvillea as flowers. They're actually modified leaves. These little things are the flowers, okay? Generally, you can't even see the flowers because the bougainvillea show is so crazy colorful. You miss the flowers, but what you're actually looking at is a colorful show of modified leaves known as, or specialized leaves known as bracts. This happens with a lot of plants. Now, next identifying characteristic, leaf arrangement. Leaf arrangement. We alluded to it here, right? So here we're back to our fraxinus, our ash tree. We've got opposite. It says opposite here. Okay. This is the in reference to the arrangement of the leaves along the stem. At the node, there are two leaves, compound leaves, coming off of that node, and they are opposite each other. There's opposite, alternate, and whorled. There's some weirdo plants that have sort of all three. Some weirdo plants that have two of the three. Some weirdo plants that have alternate for the bottom half of the stem, and then it switched to opposite on the top half. But those are oddballs, right? Those are some outliers. We're just talking about, let's be able to recognize these: opposite, alternate, and whorled. So here is an example of opposite leaves. Pretty sure this is Vinca major. So opposite leaves, just like that fraxinus or that ash. Opposite at the node, two leaves coming off of that node. Here's an example of alternate leaves. Alternate leaves. So there's a single leaf coming off of the node, stem up, inner node, single leaf coming off the other side. Okay, so alternate, opposite, and finally whorled. Okay, sometimes it's more than just three, but an example of whorled leaf arrangement is oleander. Okay, and this person is holding an oleander stem, so they're whorled around it. Okay, and then some other like interesting characteristics that go deeper, and we don't need to go into this just for your own knowledge, is that there's some plants that have opposite leaves, just like here, jump back to this fraxinus. You can see that the opposite leaves come off and they're not switching, okay? opposite to the left, opposite to the right, left, right, left, right. There's some arrangements that opposite alternates. Okay, so it's opposite. You see one going off to the left, one going off to the right. And then if you go up to the next, you see this one that's coming straight at you, and the other one would be going behind that stem. Okay, so again, they're considered opposite leaves, but there's some sort of like alternating characteristic that helps us to identify it. What you need to know right now: opposite leaves, alternate leaves, whorled leaves. Oh, wait, there's more. Okay, so this is pretty simple stuff. Now we get into leaf shapes. Okay, so leaf shapes themselves. Here's examples of leaf shapes. Now, I don't expect you to memorize leaf shapes. Okay, it's good to know them. You know, the typical ones: lanceolate, elliptical, oval, linear, reniform, hestate. Okay, these are ones that we see pretty often. Okay, and then there's some other ones, and there's more than this. This isn't like these aren't the only ones. But again, I don't make you memorize this. I think that's ridiculous. Okay, use your resources. You always have some sort of resource at your fingertips. Typically, you know, your little phone box here. That can help you, right? If you can manage to shove all of this into your brain and memorize it, good for you. I never could. So I use forms, I use references, I use keys. If I find a leaf that I'm not familiar with, I'm going to look at it and say, okay, lanceolate. But if it's an odd one, I don't have all these memorized by heart. Okay, I recognize all the names, but if you said, you know, draw an outline of an obcordate leaf, I wouldn't be able to do it unless I looked at it. Okay, so most important thing for me is that you just understand that these are leaf shapes. There's keys and forms that can help us to identify these leaf shapes, and we use these leaf shapes to help us to identify plants. Leaf margins, lobed, undulate leaves, sinuate leaves. Okay, there's a sinuous curve to it. Incised leaves. Okay, difference between incised leaves and lobed leaves. This is a lobe, okay, but it's incised, so these are all at points. Crenate, serrate, one we see all the time. So little saw teeth on it, but greatly stretched out. Cerulate looks like a little hacksaw. Doubly serrate, where we've got some serrate portions in there and then some intermediate serrations between it. Dentate, those are like serrations, but they're not pointed. They're mostly just undulating through there. Now, the undulate portion of it, typically, if you look straight down on a leaf, you don't really see it. It's looking at the side of the leaf, and you'll see there's a real wave to that leaf margin. Leaf bases, same thing: oblique, rounded, truncate, cordate, etc. Leaf apexes or leaf tips, right? All different tip types that help us to identify what that plant is. Okay, so then there's some other things. We'll just go into one. So there's additional characteristics other than just leaf shape, margin, etc. There's also things like pubescence. Okay, so sometimes there's pubescence or hairs on the top and the bottom. Sometimes there's only hairs on the top. Sometimes there's only hairs on the bottom, etc. Okay, but all sorts of different ways to be able to identify plant parts, and specifically leaves in this case. Okay, so that being said, that takes us through leaves, leaf parts at a pretty high level. Okay, of course, there's always micro levels that go deeper and deeper and deeper, and that we can identify what kind of pubescence it is. There's all sorts of different types of pubescence, but key pieces here are basic plant parts, leaf parts, and identifying characteristics, simple leaves, compound leaves, even and odd compound leaves, palmately compound leaves, bipinnately compound leaves, lobes, specialized leaves, and leaf arrangement, as well as leaf shape, margins, base, apex. All of these things we use to identify plants. Okay. Pretty easy one for this session. Thank you guys.